I've lamented on this blog about the sad state of affairs that underlies the science in forensic science. In my personal opinion, I think the root of the problem really is fourfold. Number one, criminal defense attorneys not learning science. I squarely point the finger and even wag it at most of my colleagues and predecessors. It is part of our role to be the all-important check to the advocacy of the government's scientists. Yet for far too long, we have sat stupefied on the sidelines like a bunch of tourists in the courtroom for almost 100 years, allowing unchallenged into evidence various methods, assays, and whole disciplines that should have been challenged. Now we have a mess on our hands. It is primarily our fault. Shame on the criminal defense bar. We all need to wake up. The second source of the problem are judges and appellate court justices who choose not to become educated on the science. In part because of number one that we talked about above about the criminal defense lawyers. After all, judges and justices can only rule based upon the record that's developed. We have judges and appellate court justices that are not scientific skeptics. In fact, some of them are unabashed modern Luddites. However, they all have the same duty, and some have failed to honor to be gatekeepers of the scientific evidence per Dalbert and Fry. They allow unscientific arguments such as, it must be valid because we've been doing it like this for X number of years, so substitute for scientific proof and validity. Shame, I say, on them. Number three, the new model of prosecution and prosecution agencies is to blame. There has developed a frightening new model over the last 10 years or so where the prosecution seeks conviction at all costs instead of justice. Perhaps it's the fault of television dramas, but it is still a choice they make. In terms of determining the prosecuting of the merits of any given case, this new model features, quote, confirmation over investigation, end quote. The latter is the proper way where detectives and scientists work to seek to collect all the data first and then interpret the data to arrive at a data-driven decision, whereas the former, this new model, focuses on the conclusion, then seeks information to support its preconceived notion. The criminal justice system should be about fair investigation where the total universe of possibilities are explored and must not be an exercise in controlled confirmation to arrive at preconceived notions. Number four, the massive dumbing down of instrumentation by manufacturers. It used to be that forensic science had classically trained scientists at the helm, as these activities undertaken in the early years of forensic science were not a full-time vocation. The initial forensic science world was populated by and large by the academics found at universities and colleges who were part-time consultants to the crime lab, before there was even crime labs. As requests for greater forensic analysis increased, this model had to change. Forensics no longer became an occasional event used in an odd case. In fact, it became a substitute for investigation at times. Why canvass a neighborhood for witnesses or seek other evidence that takes time when it's easier to search for and examine and look for a fingerprint left at a scene of a crime? I guess they tried to realize. This fundamental change in the call for forensic science in terms of sheer volume of analysis over the years ran squarely into the lack of true scientists to do the meaningful analysis. In other words, demand was up, but supply did not keep pace. Also, this lack of supply in terms of credentialed scientists ran squarely into budget constraints. More demand for forensic science services means more expenditure. At or around this time, perhaps coincidentally, the manufacturers simplified the instrumentation. It was dumbed down to such a degree that it became so very easy to get a result, regardless of whether or not it's a valid or true result, and just any result, that technicians replaced scientists in the laboratory. Why pay for an expensive PhD holder when you can train nearly anyone to simply push a button? Fewer and fewer credentialed scientists who have been formally trained in the core concepts of science are in forensic science nowadays. More and more folks are simply being trained in a process or the following of steps of an instruction without the ability to answer the fundamental question of why am I doing this opposed to something else? Why in this order? In other words, there are no true experts, just busy bees in the lab. I've seen a move in the last several years to address the first issue having to do with criminal defense lawyers. It is slowly changing, and far too slowly, perhaps not even close to fast enough, but there is change. This will take time. I think the third issue is something that will also be corrected over the long run, as problem number one is being addressed, but also requires education of prosecutors and prosecuting agencies, which is perhaps getting better. Fortunately, over a rather short period of time, number two will be corrected as mandatory requirements for retirements come. The real problem for me is the fourth point that we just talked about. How do we change that? How do we reverse the trend against science and math education in the United States? It's a very big problem. When you have a person in power like Senate Minority Leader, United States Senator from Mississippi Trent Lott, who not too many years ago makes comments like that are on our blog, how do we encourage kids to get interested in science and math? I realize he's no longer the prominent person that he once was, but he still said it. How do we get today's youth interested in science and math? It's a huge problem. How do you cross-examine someone who has been taught how to follow procedure or how to follow instructions instead of the real science? The government chooses to miseducate or consciously fails to educate fully the underlying science to those performing the testing and calibration in the forensic science laboratory. How is that fair? How is that right? Why is that allowed to happen?